Dust settled over the ruins of a dozen frontier worlds, yet the Grand Assembly Hall remained pristine. The Galactic Concordat demanded absolute submission, mistaking diplomacy for desperation. They drafted treaties designed to break an empire, anticipating pleas, bargaining, and eventual surrender. Instead, they got silence. A briefcase snapped shut. Chairs scraped back against polished marble. In a span of seconds, the human delegation turned their backs on the galaxy, leaving behind a silence far heavier than any declaration of war. The Citadel of Concordance hung in the neutral void of the Veil sector, a massive station forged from white gold alloys and self-aggrandizing geometry. It was designed to make visitors feel small. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into artificial clouds. Sweeping arches of translucent stone refracted the harsh light of a nearby blue dwarf star. It was a monument to a coalition that had not lost a war in 3 centuries. Ambassador Thomas sat at the center of a curved obsidian table, staring at the empty chairs opposite him. His gray suit felt too heavy for the climate-controlled air. Next to him, General David stared straight ahead, his dress uniform pristine, the medals on his chest catching the pale starlight. To Thomas's left, Secretary Sarah typed rhythmically on a slate glass interface, her face an unreadable mask of focus. They had been waiting for 2 hours. Thomas looked at his watch. An old mechanical thing. The second hand swept across the face with a relentless quiet ticking that seemed deafening in the cavernous room. "They're playing the game," Sarah murmured, her fingers never pausing. "Standard psychological pressure tactic. Make the lesser species wait. Let the silence erode their confidence. They read too many of their own history books," David replied. His voice was a low rumble gravel grinding under heavy tires. He didn't blink. "If they wanted to intimidate us, they should have bombed us. Sitting in a waiting room just makes me tired." Thomas rubbed his eyes. He was tired, not just from the waiting, but from the 3 years of grinding bloody conflict that had brought them to this table. The Concordat had pushed into the Outer Rim territories, burning agricultural colonies and cracking mining outposts, assuming the scattered human settlements were easy pickings. Humanity had fought back with retrofitted freighters and jury-rigged orbital defenses. They traded space for time. Millions had died on worlds with names the politicians in this very room couldn't pronounce. The Concordat thought they were winning. They looked at the casualty reports and the lost territory and deduced that the Terran Alliance was on the brink of collapse. They didn't know about the black sites in the Oort clouds. They didn't know about the shipyards buried beneath the ice of Europa, churning out dreadnoughts while the galaxy slept. Thomas was here to offer them a way out, a chance to stop before the real human war machine woke up and turned the sector to ash. The massive double doors at the far end of the hall finally hissed open. The air pressure in the room shifted, popping Thomas's ears. A delegation of 6 stepped through. They wore flowing ceremonial robes of deep crimson and indigo colors of authority in a dozen star systems. Though they were of varying species, some tall and spindly, others broad, and scaled the translation matrices embedded in their collars had assigned them standard Terran diplomatic monikers for the sake of the human delegation. Leading the pack was High Counselor Wallace. He was tall, his skin a pale pearlescent blue, his eyes entirely black and devoid of pupils. He moved with a glacial practiced grace, ascending the dais that placed the Concordat delegation physically higher than the humans. Behind him trailed Fleet Admiral Mitchell and Minister Grant, exchanging quiet, amused glances. They didn't look like leaders walking into a peace summit to end a war. They looked like landlords arriving to evict a tenant. Wallace took the center seat. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't nod. He simply smoothed the fabric of his robe and tapped a crystalline console on his desk. "The Concordat acknowledges the presence of the Terran delegation," Wallace said. His voice, scrubbed of its native clicks and hums by the translator, emerged in perfect sterile English. It carried an inflection of mild boredom. "We assume you have come to accept the reality of your situation." Thomas didn't stand. He folded his hands on the table. "We came to negotiate an immediate cessation of hostilities, High Counselor. The loss of life on both sides has reached unacceptable parameters. We are prepared to establish a demilitarized zone along the Veil." Grant leaned forward, a reptilian smile stretching across his narrow face. "A demilitarized zone. How quaint. You speak as if this is a discussion between equals, Ambassador Thomas." "I speak as a representative of a government that wishes to see tomorrow," Thomas replied evenly. "Your government will see tomorrow, provided it understands its place in the galaxy," Wallace interrupted. He waved a long, multi-jointed hand. A holographic projection flared to life between the two tables. It was a massive document, glowing in sharp blue text. "We are not here to negotiate, Ambassador." Wallace stated, his tone dropping an octave into something colder. "We are here to dictate terms. You sued for peace. We are generous enough to grant it. These are the conditions of your surrender." David's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. Thomas rested a hand lightly on the general's arm beneath the table. "Hold on," the gesture said. "Let them dig the hole." The hologram scrolled lazily, projecting the terms of human survival into the space between the delegations. Thomas read the words, feeling a cold, cynical calm settle over him. He had expected arrogance. He had expected harsh terms. But this was an exercise in absolute humiliation. Article 1. Wallace dictated, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "The Terran Alliance will immediately dismantle all orbital defense platforms in the Outer Rim. Your military fleet is restricted to within the orbit of your homeworld's moon. Any vessel capable of slipspace travel will be surrendered to Concordat authority for decommissioning." Sarah stopped typing. She looked up, her eyes narrowing. "That leaves 24 colony worlds entirely defenseless against piracy and rogue factions. You're stripping our infrastructure. Your colonies are a privilege granted by the Concordat Secretary, Sarah," Minister Grant sneered. "Privileges can be revoked. Be grateful we are allowing you to keep the terraformed sectors." Thomas kept his voice flat. "Continue." Wallace looked pleased. He mistook Thomas's composure for submission. Article 4. The Terran Alliance will cede all mining rights in the resource-heavy sectors of the Perseus Arm. To ensure compliance, a permanent Concordat garrison will be established on your capital world. You will foot the bill for their maintenance. "An occupation," David said. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. "A stewardship," Mitchell corrected smoothly, leaning back in his chair. The fleet admiral had spent the last 2 years bombing undefended agricultural worlds from orbit. "You clearly cannot manage your own expansion. We are providing oversight. It is for your own good." The hologram scrolled further. The text detailed crippling economic reparations, the dissolution of human central governance in favor of a Concordat-appointed viceroy, and the implementation of indentured quotas, a sanitized term for drafting human populations into Concordat labor camps. It was a slow death, A systematic dismantling of humanity, packaged in legal jargon and stamped with the seal of galactic peace. Thomas looked at the faces of the aliens across the room. He looked for a hint of compromise, a flicker of hesitation. He found nothing but the smug satisfaction of predators who believed they had cornered wounded prey. They truly believed the 3 battered fleets humanity had sacrificed on the frontier were the sum total of human resistance. They had spent months fighting reserve units, outdated frigates, and desperate militia, and they had drawn a conclusion based on a mirage, High Counselor Wallace. Thomas began his voice cutting through the hum of the holographic projector. These terms do not represent a peace treaty. They are a death sentence, masquerading as a compromise. Wallace sighed a theatrical display of exhausted patience. Ambassador, you are in no position to critique the verbiage. Your fleets are scattered. Your economy is buckling. We have burned 5 of your worlds to glass. If you refuse this treaty, we will not stop at the outer rim. We will march on Terra. We will reduce your home world to a cinder, and we will not offer these terms again. Are you certain of your intelligence, Fleet Admiral? David asked, his eyes locking on to Mitchell. You believe our military is broken. Mitchell chuckled. It was an ugly, wet sound. General David, I have personally overseen the destruction of your 3rd and 5th fleets. Your ships are fragile. Your tactics are primitive. You fight with passion, but passion does not deflect plasma fire. Yes, I am quite certain your military is broken. Thomas looked down at the physical copy of his own diplomatic portfolio. It contained a treaty, a real one that offered the Concordat a chance to walk away with their borders intact, provided they paid for the reconstruction of the frontier worlds. It was a generous offer. It was the only olive branch humanity was willing to extend before opening the gates of hell. He didn't bother opening the folder. You drafted this document under the assumption that we are begging for our lives, Thomas said quietly. The acoustics of the room caught his voice, carrying it clearly to the dais. We drafted this document, Wallace corrected sharply, because you are a lesser species that has overstepped its bounds. You will sign the treaty, Ambassador, or you will die. The choice is beautifully simple. Thomas nodded slowly. He reached up and pinched the bridge of his nose. He felt a profound sense of sadness, not for his own people, but for the billions of lives that the aliens across the table were about to casually throw away through sheer blind hubris. I see, Thomas said. Thomas reached across the obsidian table. He didn't reach for a pen. He reached for the polished brass locks of his worn leather briefcase. Click, click. The sound was sharp, brittle, cutting through the heavy air of the Grand Assembly Hall like a gunshot. He gathered his encrypted datapad, sliding it neatly into the leather divider. He took the closed file folder containing the human treaty, the treaty that would have saved the Concordat, and placed it gently inside. He shut the lid. Clack, clack. Wallace frowned, his black eyes tracking the movement. Ambassador, what are you doing? The document is projected for your signature. Thomas stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket. It was a mundane, deeply human gesture, meticulously adjusting his collar before looking up at the dais. We decline, Thomas said. The words hung in the air, simple, unadorned. They lacked the theatrical flair the Concordat thrived on, which only made them more jarring. Grant blinked his reptilian features, twisting in genuine confusion. You decline. There is no negotiation here. You cannot decline. Sarah stood up, sliding her own datapad into her bag. She slung the strap over her shoulder, her face betraying absolutely nothing. David rose slowly. When the general stood to his full height, the metals on his chest clinked together softly. He adjusted his cap, setting it squarely on his head. He looked at Fleet Admiral Mitchell, and for the first time since the summit began, David smiled. It was a terrible predatory thing, completely devoid of warmth. "We just did," David said. Thomas picked up his briefcase. "This meeting is concluded. High Counselor Minister Admiral, I suggest you return to your core systems." Wallace stood up, his ceremonial robes flaring. The diplomatic veneer cracked, revealing the raw, ugly rage of an autocrat denied his victory. "If you walk out those doors, Ambassador, there will be no further talks. There will be no mercy. We will authorize orbital bombardment on every human settlement in the sector." Thomas paused, half-turned toward the exit. He looked back over his shoulder. The exhaustion was gone from his eyes, replaced by a cold, terrible clarity. "High Counselor," Thomas said softly, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "Mercy was the only thing in this briefcase, and I am taking it with me." The human delegation turned their backs. They didn't rush. They didn't march. They walked with the slow, measured pace of people who had nowhere else they needed to be and nothing left to fear. Their footsteps echoed against the marble floor, a steady rhythmic drumbeat receding toward the heavy double doors. "Fools!" Grant shouted after them, his voice shrill. "You are condemning your entire species to extinction." The humans didn't turn back. The massive doors hissed open, admitting them into the corridor, and sealed shut behind them with a heavy final thud. Silence reclaimed the assembly hall. Wallace stood at the dais, his chest heaving, his fists clenched on the crystalline console. "Arrogant primates," he spat. "They are bluffing. They have nothing left. Let them burn," Mitchell said, waving a hand dismissively, though his eyes remained fixed on the sealed doors. "I will give the order to the vanguard fleets. We will glass their outer colonies by nightfall." Before Mitchell could tap his communicator, the secondary doors beside the dais slammed open. A Concordat communications officer rushed in. His uniform was disheveled, his multifaceted eyes wide with an emotion that the leaders of the galaxy rarely saw in their own ranks: absolute panic. "High Counselor Admiral." The officer practically tripped over the steps of the dais, thrusting a blinking tactical data pad into Mitchell's hands. "Mind your composure, officer," Wallace snapped. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Mitchell looked down at the data pad. His jaw went slack. The blue pigment drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. "Admiral," Grant asked, stepping closer. "What is it? The Vale sector," Mitchell stammered. His hand shook, nearly dropping the tablet. He pressed a button routing the feed to the central holographic projector. The punitive treaty vanished. In its place, a real-time tactical map of the neutral zone illuminated the room in harsh, unforgiving red light. Wallace stared. Grant staggered back a step. The edge of the system wasn't just active. It was tearing apart. Thousands of massive energy spikes blossomed in the dark, tearing holes in the fabric of space. These weren't the retro-fitted freighters or the patchwork frigates the Concordat had fought on the frontier. These were dreadnoughts, massive, angular, ugly ships forged from black iron and spiked, bristling with kinetic railguns and thermal lances. They were pouring out of slipspace in a perfectly synchronized wall of steel that blotted out the distant stars. 5,000 capital ships. 10,000. The numbers kept climbing, overwhelming the sensor grid's ability to render them. The human military wasn't broken. It hadn't even arrived until now. By the ancestors, Grant whispered, his voice trembling as he looked at the red swarm covering the projection. What have we done? Wallace stared at the empty chairs at the obsidian table. He finally understood the heavy silence of the human delegation. He understood the tired eyes of the ambassador and the terrible smile of the general. Humanity hadn't come to the Citadel to beg for their lives. They had come to give the Concordat one last chance to save their own, and Wallace had just thrown it away. The holographic map in the center of the Grand Assembly Hall flickered, struggling to render the sheer density of the incoming contacts. Fleet Admiral Mitchell stood paralyzed. The tactical projection painted his pale skin in a sickly, pulsing crimson. He watched his vanguard, the pride of the Concordat's naval supremacy, turn from a unified blockade into a scattered mess of distress signals. Reroute the sensor feeds, Mitchell barked, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard, trying to project an authority he suddenly didn't feel. Get me a visual on those contacts, now. The communications officer, his fingers trembling over the crystalline console, bypassed the tactical overlay. The hologram shifted. The sterile red dots vanished, replaced by a live optical feed from a Concordat scout ship positioned on the edge of the Veil sector. The room went dead silent. High Counselor Wallace stopped breathing. Minister Grant grabbed the edge of the obsidian table, his knuckles turning white. They had expected to see ships. They were looking at a moving wall of industrial violence. Concordat vessels were built for elegance as much as war. They featured sweeping bioluminescent curves powered by refined zero-point cores that left trails of ionized blue stardust in their wake. They were designed to look like apex predators gliding through a pristine ocean. The human ships looked like anvils. There was no artistry in their design. They were brutal angular slabs of depleted uranium, and composite armor painted the absolute light-swallowing black of the void. They lacked glowing engine nacelles or graceful fins. They were nothing more than massive, heavily armored delivery systems for the largest kinetic weapons the galaxy had ever seen. Vanguard command to Citadel. A voice sputtered over the hall's speakers. It was Fleet Captain Taurus commanding the Concordat blockade. The transmission was laced with heavy static. Multiple slipspace ruptures. They are not decelerating. They are maintaining attack velocity. Orders, Admiral. Form a firing line, Mitchell yelled, slamming his hand onto the console. Targeting batteries to maximum spread. Burn them out of the sky. On the visual feed, the Concordat vanguard shifted. 300 elegant cruisers aligned in perfect formation, their bows glowing with the charged, searing heat of plasma lances. They fired as one. A beautiful, blinding wave of destructive energy lashed out across the dark of space, a curtain of light capable of vaporizing entire cities. It washed over the approaching human fleet. For a fraction of a second, Mitchell allowed himself a breath of relief. Nothing survived a concentrated plasma barrage. The heat alone would melt bulkheads and boil crews alive. The light faded. The human fleet emerged entirely unbothered. They weren't relying on magnetic shields or energy deflectors. The human engineers had simply recognized that heat dissipated against mass. They had strapped ablative armor plating to the fronts of their dreadnought's meters of dense sacrificial slag designed to boil away and absorb the thermal shock. The human ships didn't even break formation. They just kept coming, shedding molten metal like rainwater, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Then the humans fired back. There were no glowing beams. no theatrical flashes of energy. The human weapons relied on the oldest, most reliable physics in the universe, mass and velocity. Magnetic accelerator cannons running the entire spine of the black dreadnoughts launched dense tungsten slugs at a fraction of the speed of light. The visual feed showed the result. A Concordat cruiser, its deflector shields pulsing with 100 gigawatts of energy, simply ceased to exist. The tungsten round hit center mass. It didn't burn through the hull. It transferred so much kinetic energy in a microsecond that the ship snapped in half. The 0-point core detonated an expanding sphere of blue fire that swallowed 2 neighboring frigates. Then another cruiser shattered, then 4 more. The human fleet was firing in rolling volleys, tearing the Concordat blockade to pieces with ruthless metronomic precision. They weren't fighting a war. They were conducting an industrial demolition. "They're ignoring the shields," the communications officer whispered, staring at the feed. "The kinetic impact. The shields can't process the sheer physical mass. We're getting torn apart." Admiral Captain Torres's voice returned. He didn't sound composed anymore. He sounded like a man watching a tidal wave approach. "My port flank is gone. We cannot hold this position. I request permission to fall back to the interior rally point." Mitchell stared at the hologram. The vanguard of fleet that had subdued 3 planetary systems was burning out like matches in a hurricane. Retreating meant abandoning the Veil sector completely. It meant leaving the deep space shipping lanes wide open. "Hold your ground, Captain," Mitchell ordered, his voice cold. "If you break the line, they will ride your wake all the way to the inner colonies. Die at your post if you have to, but hold them." There was a long pause on the comms. In the background, alarm shrieked, accompanied by the deep structural groans of a dying ship. "With all due respect, Admiral Torres," replied, his voice flat, with the clarity of a dead man. "You can go straight to hell." The transmission cut out. The visual feed warped, consumed by a blinding flash of kinetic impact, and then died, leaving the assembly hall in the oppressive dim light of the failing tactical map. Minister Grant slumped into his chair. He looked at the space where the human delegation had sat just 20 minutes ago. "We push them," Grant whispered, his voice trembling. "We push them, and they let us." General David walked onto the command deck of the UNNS Carthage. The air smelled of ozone, recycled oxygen, and the bitter tang of cheap coffee. It was cramped, lit by harsh red battle lamps that cast long, sharp shadows across the metal bulkheads. There were no marble floors here, no vaulted ceilings or polished glass. The floor was grated steel, bolted down and worn smooth by heavy boots. It was ugly. It was functional. David felt perfectly at home. "General on deck," the watch officer shouted. "As you were," David said, not breaking stride. He walked to the central hollow table where the tactical overlay of the Veil sector glowed in crisp utilitarian green. Ambassador Thomas was already there, leaning against the railing. He had removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing tired forearms. He looked at the digital carnage unfolding on the map, watching the red triangles of the Concordat fleet vanish one by one. "Casualty report," David asked, turning to the communications pit. "Minimal, sir," a junior lieutenant replied, his fingers flying over a physical keyboard. 3rd Division took some thermal damage to their forward ablative plates. The SOM reports a minor hull breach in Sector 4, already sealed. We've pushed through their primary line. David nodded. He crossed his arms, his eyes tracking a cluster of Concordat frigates, attempting to flank the human formation. Gunnery, tell the 5th Squadron to shift their firing solution 10 degrees port. Box them in. Leave no avenues for retreat. Sir, Thomas watched the general work. It was a terrifying transformation. At the obsidian table, David had played the role of the silent, subservient soldier. Now, standing on the deck of a 3-mile-long dreadnought, he was a conductor directing an orchestra of absolute destruction. "They're breaking," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying only to David. "They never expected us to survive the initial plasma volley. They don't understand war." "Tom," David replied, his eyes never leaving the map. "They understand compliance. They've spent 300 years fighting people who surrender when the odds look bad. They treat warfare like a legal dispute. You show up with more guns, you state your terms, the other guy signs the paper." David reached out and tapped a command onto the console. "They don't know what it means to fight for survival. We do. We've spent our entire recorded history trying to wipe ourselves out. We mastered the art of killing each other on a dying rock before we ever figured out how to leave it." Thomas sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He thought about the briefcase sitting on the floor of his quarters, the treaty he had carried for light years. It felt like a lifetime ago. "I wanted them to take the deal," Thomas said. His voice was heavy, anchored by a deep, immovable sorrow. "I really did, David. I looked at that alien Wallace. I saw the arrogance, but I also saw ignorance. They had no idea what they were asking for." "You did your job," David said firmly. He looked at Thomas. "You gave them a choice. You laid out the bridge and they decided to burn it. Don't carry the weight of their suicide, Tom. My job is to make sure they never get a chance to threaten Earth again. And I am very good at my job." Secretary Sarah walked onto the deck, holding a rugged datapad. She didn't look at the tactical map. She looked at the supply logistics. "General," Sarah said, her tone brisk and professional, "the second wave is staging at the rally point. We have 3 more carrier groups dropping out of slipspace in 20 minutes. The supply lines from the Europa shipyards are secure. We have enough kinetic ordnance to bombard the Perseus arm for a decade." "Good," David grunted. "Targeting navigational data from the Citadel has been decrypted," Sarah said. She tapped her screen and a new cluster of stars illuminated on the far side of the holographic map. "We have the coordinates for their major supply depots, their orbital shipyards, and their core agricultural worlds." Thomas looked up. "Military targets only, David. We don't glass planets. We are not them. I know the rules of engagement." "Mr. Ambassador," David said, his voice cold. "We break their fleets. We break their shipyards. We cripple their infrastructure until their economy starves. We will leave their populations intact, but we will leave them in the dark." David turned back to the communication officer. "Open a wideband transmission across all concordant frequencies," David ordered. "Unencrypted, audio only." The officer worked for a moment, then gave a sharp nod. "Channel open, General. You're broadcasting to every receiver in the sector." David leaned over the microphone on the console. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound angry. He sounded like a man reciting a weather report. "This is General David of the Terran Alliance." He said, his gravelly voice cutting through the static of 100 different alien comm systems. "To the concordant military forces, your leadership was offered peace. They chose this. If you power down your weapons and disengage your engines, you will be bypassed. If you fire on my ships, you will be destroyed. There will be no warnings. There will be no second chances. Make your choice." David tapped the console, cutting the feed. He looked at the map. A few of the red triangles at the edge of the system stopped moving. Their energy signatures dimmed as captains made the smartest decision of their lives. But many more kept their weapons hot, rushing forward in a desperate, uncoordinated defense. "Gunnery," David said, his voice returning to its flat operational cadence. "Clear the board." 48 hours later, the Citadel of Concordance was no longer a monument to galactic supremacy. It was a tomb waiting to be sealed. The vaulted ceilings and white gold alloys remained pristine, but the atmosphere inside had turned toxic with panic. The wide corridors, usually filled with the quiet murmur of diplomats and aides, were chaotic. Junior officials rushed past each other, carrying physical data drives, trying to wipe mainframes before the evacuation order was given. High Counselor Wallace stood in his private chambers, staring out the massive observation window. The blue dwarf star outside cast harsh shadows across his face. He felt entirely numb. The reports had stopped being updates and had become obituaries. The Vanguard fleet was gone. The Home Guard dispatched to hold the secondary choke points had been routed in 6 hours. The human fleet didn't fight like any enemy the Concordat had ever faced. They didn't pause to secure territory. They didn't establish supply bases on conquered moons. They just kept moving. A relentless rolling wave of black armor that smashed through orbital defenses and kept pushing toward the core worlds. The door to his chambers hissed open. Minister Grant entered, his flowing robe stained with spilled calf, his eyes bloodshot. He didn't wait for permission to speak. "The shipyards at Kithara are gone," Grant said, his voice a hollow rasp. Wallace didn't turn around. "Gone, you mean captured. I mean gone, Wallace." Grant snapped his composure, finally breaking. They didn't bother sending Marines. They towed 3 asteroids out of the local belt, strapped maneuvering thrusters to them, and accelerated them into the orbital ring. The entire facility fractured. 300,000 workers, 40 capital ships in dry dock. Just gone. Wallace closed his eyes. The sheer terrifying pragmatism of it made his stomach turn. The Concordat would have spent weeks organizing a siege demanding surrender and negotiating the transfer of the shipyards. The humans simply threw rocks at it until it broke. "What of Admiral Mitchell?" Wallace asked softly. "He took the remaining dreadnoughts and tried to intercept the human spearhead at the Doria Gate," Grant replied. He walked over to a crystal decanter on a side table and poured himself a dark, viscous liquid. His hands shook so badly the glass rattled against the table. "They didn't even slow down. They fired concentrated kinetic salvos from extreme range. Mitchell's flagship was gutted before they ever got within plasma range. He's dead, Wallace." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. "They don't want our planets," Grant whispered, staring into his glass. "I reviewed the tactical logs. They bypassed 3 defenseless agricultural worlds. They just destroyed the orbital defense grids and moved on. They are systematically dismantling our ability to wage war. They are neutering us." Wallace finally turned away from the window. He looked older. The pearlescent sheen of his skin was dull. The arrogance that had anchored him just 2 days prior had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified bureaucrat, realizing he had signed his own empire's death warrant. "We need to contact them," Wallace said, his voice lacking conviction. "We need to reopen the channel. Bring Ambassador Thomas back to the table." "There is no table," Grant shouted, throwing his glass against the wall. It shattered the dark liquid, staining the pristine white stone. "Do you not understand? They are not playing our game anymore. You told them to accept reality. They are showing it to us. The communicator on Wallace's desk chimed. It was an emergency override frequency glowing a stark, flashing red. Wallace walked to the desk. He pressed the heavy seal. The holographic projector flickered to life. It didn't show a Concordat officer. It showed the grim, heavily lined face of General David. The lighting around him was harsh, military red. "High Counselor Wallace," David said. His tone held no triumph, no gloating. It was strictly business. Wallace swallowed hard. "General, the Concordat is prepared to call a ceasefire. We are willing to discuss the terms your ambassador brought to the Citadel." David didn't smile. He just stared through the camera, his eyes cold and unyielding. "You don't have the authority to call a ceasefire, High Counselor. That requires a functioning military to enforce. As of 20 minutes ago, the Concordat Naval Command Network ceased to exist." Wallace gripped the edge of his desk. "What do you want General Reparations Territory name your price?" "I don't want anything from you," David replied. "I'm calling as a courtesy. My navigation officers have plotted a firing solution from our current position at the Doria Gate. In exactly 4 hours, a volley of hypervelocity tungsten rounds will impact the Citadel of Concordance. The station will be obliterated." Grant gasped, taking a step backward. You can't. This is a diplomatic hub. It is a neutral zone. "It's a command and control center," David corrected flatly. "And you declared war on a civilian species. We are simply returning the favor. You have 4 hours to evacuate your personnel. I suggest you hurry." "General, please," Wallace begged, his pride entirely broken. He leaned over the desk, pleading with the hologram. "We can fix this. We can end the war." "The war ended the moment Ambassador Thomas closed his briefcase," David said. "This is just the cleanup." The transmission cut out. The hologram faded, leaving Wallace and Grant alone in the dimming light of the chambers. Deep within the bowels of the Citadel, the first emergency sirens began to wail. It was a mournful rising pitch that echoed through the empty marble halls. Wallace looked back out the window at the stars. He knew the black ships were out there in the dark, moving relentlessly forward, indifferent to his apologies, immune to his politics. They had demanded humanity bow. Instead, humanity had shown them how to bleed. The emergency sirens of the Citadel of Concordance did not buzz or klaxon. They sang. It was a high, mournful choral note engineered centuries ago by acoustical psychologists to induce a sense of urgency without triggering primal panic. It failed completely. The Grand Promenade, a sweeping concourse of white marble and cascading water features, was a riot of terrified diplomats, fleeing bureaucrats, and desperate socialites. The veneer of galactic supremacy, polished over 300 years of unchallenged rule, peeled away in minutes. High Counselor Wallace stood on a transit balcony overlooking the concourse, flanked by 2 heavily armed guards. He watched a prominent senator from the inner colonies violently shove a junior aide out of the way to reach a descending elevator. Elsewhere, luggage was abandoned. Silk robes were torn. The air, usually thick with the scent of engineered flora, smelled of sweat and fear. "The docking bays are overwhelmed," Minister Grant said, materializing beside Wallace. Grant's breathing was ragged. He held a bruised arm tightly against his chest. "Private shuttles are launching without clearance. They are clipping each other in the launch tubes. The automated traffic control is trying to ground them, but captains are manually overriding the locks." Wallace stared at the chaos. He felt entirely detached from his own body, 4 hours. General David had given them 4 hours. 2 of those hours had already bled away into the dark. "Where is my shuttle?" Wallace asked. His voice sounded hollow, stripped of the resonant authority he had wielded at the obsidian table. "Bay 4, Grant replied. "But we cannot reach it through the main concourse. The crowd has breached the VIP security checkpoints. The guards fired warning shots, but they were trampled. We have to take the maintenance shafts." Wallace turned his head, slowly, looking at Grant. The Minister of Expansion, the architect of the frontier war, looked like a frightened child. His scales had paled to a sickly gray. "Maintenance shafts," Wallace repeated. The words felt dirty in his mouth. He was the ruler of a coalition of 50 star systems. He dictated the fates of billions. Now he was being told to crawl through the bowels of his own monument to escape a species he had dismissed as primitive. "Wallace, we have to move," Grant pleaded, grabbing the High Counselor's sleeve. "The human dreadnoughts are sitting on the edge of the system. They aren't maneuvering. They aren't charging weapons. They are just sitting there, waiting." "They are doing the math," Wallace whispered. He allowed Grant to pull him away from the balcony. The 2 guards fell in behind them, their plasma rifles drawn, their eyes darting at every shadow. They moved away from the vaulted halls and into the utilitarian gray corridors hidden behind the walls. The air here was stale-smelling of ozone and recycled grease. As they hurried down a narrow steel stairwell, the station shuddered. It was a subtle vibration felt in the teeth before it registered in the floorboards. "Was that an impact?" Grant gasped, freezing on the steps. "No," one of the guards said, checking a wrist-mounted tactical display. "Massive energy spike in the lower engineering decks. A civilian transport just suffered a containment failure trying to hot drop from the launch bay. It took out the primary transit rail." Wallace kept walking. He didn't look back. He didn't ask how many died. He only thought of the black iron ships hanging in the void and the terrible crushing silence of the human ambassador. Mercy was the only thing in this briefcase. They reached a heavy blast door. Grant punched in an override code, his fingers slipping on the glass keypad. The door ground open, revealing Bay 4. It was a cavernous hangar lit by stark emergency lights. In the center sat Wallace's personal escape vessel, a sleek silver needle designed for speed and comfort. But the bay wasn't empty. Nearly 50 low-level maintenance workers and cargo loaders had broken through the exterior airlocks. They were clustered around the landing struts of the shuttle, begging the pilot to lower the ramp. When they saw Wallace enter, the desperation in their eyes turned to raw, burning anger. "There's room," a heavy-set cargo master shouted, pointing at the massive shuttle. "We have families. You can't leave us here to die for your war." The 2 guards leveled their rifles. "Stand back," the lead guard barked. "Clear the perimeter." The crowd surged forward, driven by the absolute certainty of their impending death. They had nothing left to lose. Grant panicked. "Fire!" he screamed. "Clear a path!" The guards hesitated. They were ceremonial protectors trained to look intimidating during parades and summits. They were not butchers. Wallace stepped forward. He reached out and gently pushed the barrel of the lead guard's rifle down. He looked at the crowd. He saw their dirt-stained hands, their terrified eyes. He saw the very people his empire was built upon, the people he had sworn to protect. "Let them on," Wallace said. Grant stared at him aghast. "What, sir? It violates protocol. The life support will hold." Wallace interrupted his voice, finally finding a shred of its former strength. "Lower the ramp. Pack them into the cargo hold, all of them. The pilot, watching from the cockpit, engaged the hydraulics. The heavy ramp lowered with a hiss. The crowd rushed aboard, weeping, dragging their children by the arms. Wallace waited until the last of them was inside before he walked up the incline. He didn't go to the plush leather seats of the command cabin. He stood by the airlock door, looking out at the hangar of the Citadel one last time. "Launch," Wallace ordered. The shuttle's thrusters ignited, pressing him back against the bulkhead. The massive bay doors opened to the blackness of space. As the shuttle shot out into the void, joining a chaotic swarm of thousands of fleeing vessels, Wallace looked back through the viewport. The Citadel hung in the dark, brilliant and beautiful, a pearl suspended in nothingness. It looked eternal. Wallace closed his eyes. He knew exactly what time it was. Aboard the UNNS Carthage, the silence was absolute. The command deck was stripped of all extraneous noise. The chatter of the communications pit had ceased. The low hum of the tactical holotable was the only sound in the room. Ambassador Thomas stood beside General David. Both men watched the digital timer counting down in the upper right corner of the holographic display. 000412. Evacuation status, David asked quietly. Secretary Sarah tapped her datapad. "A mess, General. The local space around the Citadel is choked with traffic. They don't have proper traffic control. We're reading at least 4 collisions in the last hour. But the station itself is venting atmosphere in the lower decks to power down non-essential systems. It looks like the vast majority of the population has cleared the blast radius." David nodded slowly. He didn't take any pleasure in this. He was a soldier, a mechanic of war. The task before him was entirely mechanical. A structure needed to be removed. He was applying the necessary force to remove it. Thomas crossed his arms, staring at the green projection of the Citadel on the map. "They built that station 300 years ago," Thomas murmured. "It survived the unification wars. It survived the plague years. It was supposed to be the shining beacon on the hill for the entire galaxy." "It's a command bunker with a good PR department," David said flatly. "And it's currently coordinating the defensive grids for their inner colonies. We break the bunker, the grid falls apart. We secure the border." 000245. "Are we sure about this, David?" Thomas asked. He didn't look at the general. He just watched the numbers tick down. "Once we pull this trigger, there's no going back. We are permanently cementing ourselves as the monsters in the dark. We will be the species that destroyed the Concordat. We didn't start the fire." Tom David replied, his voice a low, steady rumble. "They came to our worlds. They burned our farms. They laughed at us in that polished room. If being the monster in the dark is what keeps Earth safe, I will gladly wear the fangs. I'd rather be a living monster than a dead diplomat." Thomas closed his eyes and nodded. He knew David was right. The mathematics of survival were cruel, but they were undeniable. 000030 gunnery, David called out. "Sir," the gunnery officer replied, his hands resting on dual physical key switches. "Confirm firing solution. Solution locked, targeting the central stabilization axis. Distance is 42 light seconds. Ordnance is a 50-ton depleted uranium slug. Magnetic coils are fully charged, awaiting your command." David looked at the timer. 000005, 000040000003. David didn't shout. He didn't inject any drama into the moment. He simply gave the order the way a man orders a cup of coffee. "Fire!" Deep within the bowels of the Carthage, a mechanical sequence initiated. Massive capacitors dumped gigawatts of energy into a linear array of magnetic coils spanning the length of the dreadnought. A 50-ton cylinder of dense, unyielding metal was pulled forward, accelerating exponentially. The ship shuddered violently. A deep, bone-rattling thump echoed through the deck plating. Out in the void, the front of the Carthage flared with a brief, blinding flash of displaced energy. The slug exited the barrel at a significant fraction of the speed of light. It was a weapon of pure, terrifying physics. It carried no explosive payload. It had no guidance system. It didn't need one. At that velocity, the kinetic energy of the impact was greater than a cluster of thermonuclear warheads. On the command deck, they waited. 42 seconds later, the optical feed updated. The citadel of Concordance did not explode. Explosions require oxygen. Explosions are messy, fiery things. The station simply shattered. The 50-ton slug struck the central stabilization axis perfectly. The transfer of kinetic energy was instantaneous and total. The white gold alloys, the vaulted ceilings, the obsidian tables, the grand promenade, all of it instantly vaporized at the point of impact, expanding outward in a shock wave of pulverized debris. The massive rings of the station detached, spinning wildly out of control. Bulkheads crumpled like wet paper. The pristine monument to galactic supremacy was reduced to an expanding cloud of jagged shrapnel and glittering dust in the span of a single heartbeat. There was no sound, just the cold, silent visual of a civilization's pride being erased from the map. David looked at the tactical display. The massive green icon representing the citadel flickered, broke into dozens of smaller pieces, and then vanished from the board. The local defensive grid spanning the inner colonies instantly dropped offline. The hammer had fallen. The anvil was broken. "Target neutralized," the gunnery officer reported quietly. David exhaled. "Signal the fleet, break formation, secure the perimeter of the dead zone, deploy the minefields." Secretary Sarah broadcast the final decree. Thomas turned away from the hollow table. He walked over to a small observation window, looking out into the cold black of space. He had brought a briefcase full of peace to a galaxy that only understood power. He had watched that galaxy burn itself alive simply because it refused to look a human in the eye and treat them as an equal. It was a tragedy born of arrogance, and humanity had been forced to write the final act. The border station terminus hung in the absolute zero of the void, a crude iron padlock clamped onto the edge of what the galactic charts now formally designated as the dead zone. It was not a station designed to welcome. There were no sweeping arches, no translucent stone refracting starlight, and certainly no climate-controlled promenades. Terminus had been welded together from the salvaged armor plating of crippled dreadnoughts and the gutted hulls of industrial freighters. It was an ugly brutalist fortress of gray steel bristling with sensor arrays and kinetic batteries. It sat exactly on the coordinate line where the human fleet had simply stopped moving. They had not marched on the Concordate capital. They had not deployed marine divisions to occupy the sprawling agricultural worlds or the shimmering core systems. They had violently shoved the Concordate military out of a 50-light-year radius, seeded the resulting vacuum with millions of autonomous stealth mines, and parked their black ships in silent overwatch. Director Cole stepped off his shuttle into the docking bay of Terminus, pulling his heavy cloak tighter around his narrow shoulders. Cole was a low-level minister of the former Concordate Agricultural Logistics Division. 6 months ago, his biggest concern had been grain tariffs in the Perseus Arm. Today, he was the highest-ranking surviving civilian official of his government. Everyone above him, everyone who had sat in the vaulted halls of the Citadel, was either dead captured or hiding in self-imposed exile on the fringes of the galaxy. The human guards waiting for him did not wear ceremonial robes. They wore scuffed gray combat armor carrying kinetic rifles with a casual, terrifying familiarity. They didn't salute. They didn't speak. They simply turned and walked toward a heavy blast door, expecting Cole to follow. The air inside the station was painfully dry, smelling of recycled oxygen, hot metal, and old sweat. Cole's respiratory gills flared uncomfortably. He was used to the carefully humidified, flora-scented corridors of the core worlds. Here, every breath felt like inhaling sandpaper. They led him down a long, narrow corridor where the floor grates clattered underfoot. The lighting was strictly utilitarian, casting harsh shadows that made the station feel more like a submarine than a diplomatic hub. The guard stopped at a nondescript metal door, slid it open, and stepped aside. Cole walked into the briefing room. It was small, barely larger than a storage closet. In the center sat a folding metal table, its surface scratched and dented. 2 humans were already there. Ambassador Thomas sat on one side of the table. He wore the exact same gray suit he had worn at the Citadel half a year prior. It hung looser on him now. His face was deeply lined, the skin around his eyes bruised with chronic exhaustion. He looked like a man who had not slept deeply since the war began. General David stood by the room's single thick viewport, his back to the stars. He had discarded the dress uniform of the old diplomatic summits. He wore standard shipboard fatigues, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and faded scars. He was perfectly still, a predator resting in the shade. Cole took the lone, empty metal chair opposite Thomas. It creaked under his weight. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the low, rhythmic thrum of the station's life support systems, a heartbeat of heavy machinery. Thomas reached into his jacket. He didn't pull out a crystalline data slate or a holographic projector. He pulled out a single sheet of physical paper printed with dense black ink. He slid it across the scratched metal table. Cole looked down at it. He didn't reach for it. "This is the Armistice Director Cole," Thomas said. His voice was soft, worn down to the gravel. "We have translated it into your primary syntax." Cole stared at the fibrous texture of the paper. It was such a primitive medium, dead organic matter pressed flat and stained. It felt insulting. "There are no subclauses," Cole noted, his large, multifaceted eyes scanning the single page. "There are no economic concessions listed, no trade agreements, no establishment of permanent diplomatic channels." "No," Thomas agreed, his expression utterly blank. "There aren't." Cole looked up, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them on his lap. "You destroyed our shipyards at Kythera. You shattered our central command infrastructure. Our economy is in a depression, the likes of which our historians do not have words for. We are struggling to feed the outer colonies without the central logistics hub to coordinate the freighters. And you offer us nothing. No reconstruction aid. No transitional terms. You don't get to dictate transition, Director," David said, from the shadows near the viewport. The general's voice was hard, lacking any trace of the polite fiction they had maintained at the Citadel. "Surrendering implies we want to take responsibility for you. We don't. We don't want your worlds. We don't want your resources, your grain, or your technology. We just want you to leave us alone." "But millions will starve," Cole pleaded, his voice breaking. the sheer terrifying weight of the galaxy he had inherited pressed down on his chest. We built an entire society on interdependency. You severed the head. The body is dying. We need access to the Perseus arm trade routes to move the harvest. Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Director, 6 months ago, your leadership drafted a treaty that would have put human populations into indentured labor camps. They promised to glass our homeworld if we didn't sign it. We didn't break your farms. We broke the warships you used to enforce your will upon the galaxy. If your people starve now, it is because your empire forgot how to plant its own food while it was busy stealing ours. Cole closed his eyes. The brutal, unapologetic truth of it stung worse than a physical blow. For centuries, the Concordat had operated on the assumption that every species wanted what they had. They assumed humanity was fighting to conquer, to take their place at the top of the galactic hierarchy, to claim the throne of the Citadel. But these humans didn't want the throne. They had blown the throne to dust. They just wanted to build a wall around their house and be left in peace. The line drawn on the map attached to that document is absolute. Thomas continued his tone, shifting from empathetic to bureaucratic. It is the new border. Human space is on one side. Concordat space is on the other. If a Concordat military vessel crosses that line, it will be fired upon. If an unannounced civilian vessel crosses that line, it will be seized or destroyed. We will not trade with you. We will not speak with you. We are closing the door. You are isolating yourselves, Cole whispered, opening his eyes to look at the two humans. You are locking yourselves in the dark. The galaxy is vast. You cannot survive alone. David let out a short, humorless breath. He stepped away from the window, leaning over the table, so his face was level with Cole's. We like the Dark Director, David replied. We grew up in it. We thrived in it. We survived ourselves in it. Do not mistake our isolation for vulnerability. Cole realized there was no negotiation. There never had been. The humans had not invited him here to discuss terms. They had invited him here to witness a final decree. He reached into his heavy robes, producing a stylized metallic stylus. His hand shook violently as he pressed the tip to the coarse human paper. The biometric ink bled into the fibers, leaving a permanent dark streak at the bottom of the page. He didn't bother reading the legal phrasing. There was no point. The humans had the dreadnoughts. They made the rules. Cole pushed the paper back across the table. Thomas picked it up. He smoothed the corner with his thumb, then folded it neatly in half. He reached down to the floor beside his chair and lifted his worn leather briefcase onto the table. He placed the signed paper inside. Click, click. The sound of the brass lock snapping shut was sharp, metallic, and final. It echoed off the steel walls of the small room. It was the exact same sound that had signaled the end of the peace talks at the Citadel. But this time, it did not herald the beginning of a war. It signaled the death of an era and the beginning of a cold, unbroken silence. Thank you, Director Cole, Thomas said, wrapping his hand around the leather handle of the briefcase. Your shuttle has been refueled. It is waiting in Bay 2. The flight path back to your core systems has been cleared through the minefield. I suggest you return to your people. You have a tremendous amount of rebuilding to do. Cole stood up slowly. His joints ached. He looked at Thomas and then at David. He opened his mouth desperately, wanting to offer some parting platitude, some warning about the wheel of history turning, or some final grasp at dignity. But he found he had absolutely nothing to say. The arrogance had been beaten out of his civilization, replaced by a cold, hollow reality. He turned and walked out of the room. The heavy blast door hissed shut behind him, sealing the seal perfectly. Thomas watched the door for a long moment. Then he set the briefcase down on the table and sank back into his chair. He let out a long, slow exhalation. The rigid posture he had maintained for the meeting dissolved, and the sheer crushing exhaustion of the last 3 years seemed to settle deep into his marrow all at once. "It's over," Thomas whispered, rubbing his face with both hands. David didn't sit. He walked back over to the small viewport on the wall. Outside, the UNNS Carthage drifted slowly past the station, a massive, jagged black silhouette, blotting out the distant glittering stars of the Concordate core systems. "For now," David grunted. His voice was quieter, lacking the theatrical edge he used for the aliens. "They'll rebuild. Empires always do. In 50 years or 100 years, they might forget what happened here. Some new high counselor will read a history book, look at the border, and think they can push it." Thomas looked up at the general's broad back. "And if they do," David didn't smile. He didn't blink. He just kept his eyes on the black dreadnought outside the window, watching the massive kinetic batteries track silently through the void. "Then we'll remind them," David said. "We hold the line, Tom. That's all we can ever do. We hold the line." The silence settled over the room, heavy and absolute. It wasn't the arrogant silence of the Concordate at the height of their power, nor was it the fearful, chaotic silence of the evacuated citadel. It was the quiet, enduring silence of humanity, a species that had looked directly into the abyss of their own extinction, drawn a line in the stars, and calmly decided to build a fence. The arrogance of an empire shattered against the iron will of a species that refused to break. Humanity didn't just win a war. They fundamentally rewrote the rules of the galaxy, leaving a heavy, permanent silence in their wake. If you felt the cold impact of the human dreadnoughts and loved this grounded, cynical take on HFY, smash that like button and share the story. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another deep space drama. Drop a comment below. Would you have ordered the strike on the Citadel or tried one last time to negotiate?